When a teen vandalized the Korean War Memorial, Clint Eastwood didn't just stand by. His words echoed through the National Mall, turning a reckless act into an unforgettable lesson. The air was cool, carrying the quiet hum of the city beyond the National Mall. The Korean War Veterans Memorial stood solemnly beneath the overcast sky, its 19 steel soldiers frozen in time, their faces etched with the weight of a war long past. Families walked among them, some speaking in hushed tones, others standing in silent reverence. Clint Eastwood stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, his gaze locked on the statues. He had seen a lot in his lifetime: wars, protests, history repeating itself, but this place always made him pause. It wasn't just another monument. It was a reminder. A child's voice broke the stillness. "Dad, what does that say?" Clint's brow furrowed. He turned, following the child's pointing finger. Then he saw it. Bright red paint slashed across the steel faces, angry streaks dripping down like fresh wounds. The words scrawled across them made his stomach turn. Communist slogans, insults, symbols mocking the very men this memorial honored. Gasps spread like wildfire. A woman covered her mouth. An elderly veteran, his cap embroidered with his unit's emblem, shook his head in quiet disbelief. Then, a teenager stepped forward, a spray can in his grip. His hood was up, his shoulders squared, like he was proud of what he'd done. The last untouched statue stood before him, its solemn gaze unbroken. He lifted the can, finger hovering over the nozzle. Then, a firm hand caught his wrist. He jerked, startled, turned, and met the steel-eyed stare of Clint Eastwood. The murmurs, the whispers, the shifting feet of bystanders, all of it faded into the background. Then a voice, low, unshaken. "Are you out of your mind?" The teenager's expression twisted in defiance the moment he recognized Clint Eastwood. Yanking at his trapped wrist, he spat, "They ended communism just to serve the capitalists. They were wrong." Clint didn't flinch. He stood firm, his grip steady, his gaze locked on the vandalized statue. Then, in a measured tone, he spoke. He wasn't fighting communists, he was ensuring your right to do this. His words cut through the air, echoing off the memorial's stone walls. The crowd stirred, murmurs spreading. What did he mean? One man in the gathering whispered, "The way he said that, it's like he fought beside him." Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice rang out. "Indeed, Clint was in the Korean War." A hush fell over the memorial. People exchanged stunned glances. Someone exhaled sharply. Even the teenager, still locked in Clint's grip, hesitated, his defiance wavering for the first time. The teen, now freed from Clint's grip, said, "Just because you're old? You think you know everything?" The crowd tensed. They knew Clint as a no-nonsense icon. No one dared speak to him like that. This was new. But Clint remained calm, not out of hesitation, not because he lacked words or action, but out of respect for where he stood. Before the teen could respond, a sharp voice from the crowd broke the silence. "You think that's bravery? Defacing a memorial?" The words hit like a slap, but before he could react, another man stepped forward, his face tight with fury. "You vandalized my great-grandfather's name." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with rage and heartbreak. The teen's defiance flickered. His grip on the spray can be tightened, but his stance shifted, uneasy. He scanned the crowd, faces full of anger, disbelief, and disappointment. His pulse quickened. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression, but still he refused to yield. Then the dam broke. "Call security!" someone shouted. Another voice followed. "He needs to be arrested!" Murmurs turned into a roar of outrage, swelling around him. A woman gasped. An elderly veteran clenched his jaw, eyes locked on the teen with quiet disdain. The weight of his actions crashed down on him. The air was thick with tension. The teen swallowed hard. He had wanted attention, just not like this. Now, the control had slipped from his hands, but Clint stood still, listening to the crowd, his eyes fixed on the boy. There was something more here, Something beyond reckless defiance. What made him see the world this way? Clint wasn't sure, but he wanted to know. He had learned long ago that defiance doesn't come from nowhere. It's built on something: pain, anger, belief, and punishment alone wouldn't change that. As the police pushed through the crowd, ready to take the teen into custody, Clint did something no one expected. He raised a hand and said, "Stop." That was it, just a few words. The crowd froze. The anger that had filled the air moments ago was now tinged with confusion. Eyes darted between Clint and the teen, searching for an explanation for why he had stopped the arrest. Some clenched their fists, still seething over the desecrated memorial. Others hesitated, their outrage momentarily shaken by curiosity. Whispers spread like wildfire, yet no one dared to speak. Instead, they waited, watching, wondering, what did Clint Eastwood see in this teen that made him worth saving? Clint heard the whispers but paid them no mind. His focus was on the teen, the anger, the defiance, the pain simmering beneath it all. What had driven him to this? Maybe it was something Clint had once wrestled with himself, the raw disbelief he felt when he was first sent to war, watching bodies fall before his eyes, realizing men were slaughtered not for survival, but for a narrative. He wanted to understand. He had to. His voice cut through the tension. "What do you think really happened during the war?" Clint watched as the teen hesitated, his body tense, fists clenched around the spray can. His eyes burned with anger, but there was something else, something deeper, harder to name. The mask covered most of his face, but it wasn't just to hide his identity. It was a shield, a barrier between himself and the world that had already judged him. The murmurs of the crowd faded as two officers moved in, their uniforms stiff with authority. They grabbed the teen by his arms, pulling him away from the defaced statues. He resisted at first, his feet dragging against the stone, but he wasn't fighting anymore. He wasn't running. That's when Clint noticed. He was Asian. The realization struck like a dull thud, but it wasn't enough to explain everything. There was more to this than reckless defiance or misguided anger. Clint stepped forward, ignoring the growing calls for punishment. He lowered his voice, his tone cutting through the air like a knife. "If you wish to be saved, this is the time," Clint said, his voice steady. "Speak. Why did you deface them?" The teen, though shaken, still held on to his defiance. His breathing was heavy, his hands trembled slightly, but he met Clint's gaze without flinching. Then his voice, raw with emotion, broke through the silence. "You fought against my father," he spat, "and killed him, just because they were communists. Where's justice in that?" The words hung in the air, heavier than the crowd's judgment, heavier than the spray paint dripping from the statues. For the first time, Clint wasn't just looking at a reckless teen, he was looking at a son searching for justice in the only way he knew how. For a moment, everyone was shocked. Silence fell over the crowd, the weight of the teen's words settling like a heavy fog. Clint, who knew what happened, stood unmoving, his gaze fixed on the boy. The accusations hung in the air, raw and unresolved. The authorities hesitated, waiting for Clint to give a sign. The crowd shifted uneasily, some still simmering with anger, others suddenly unsure. The teen, his breathing heavy, clenched his fists, his masked face unreadable, but his eyes burned with defiance. Clint took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate. The years had taught him that anger met with anger led nowhere. He had seen young men like this before, so certain, so filled with rage, yet unaware of the full picture. His voice, deep and measured, cut through the tense air. Clint's gaze never wavered. He took another measured step forward, his voice low but firm. "You say I fought against your father?" His tone wasn't accusing, nor was it apologetic. It was steady, unwavering. "That I killed him?" The teen stiffened. His grip on the spray can was so tight his knuckles turned white. His breath came in uneven bursts, his chest rising and falling as if he were struggling to contain something. Rage, grief, or maybe both. His masked face hid his expression, but his posture betrayed him. His shoulders trembled ever so slightly, his stance no longer defiant but uncertain. His voice, when it finally came, was raw, edged with pain. "You didn't have to. He was just a soldier. Just my father." The last words caught in his throat, like they had been buried too deep for too long. He shook his head sharply, as if trying to suppress the emotions threatening to surface. "I grew up with nothing but stories of what he fought for, how he died. And for what? A war he didn't start? A war you were a part of?" His breath hitched, and for the first time he took a step back, not out of fear, but out of the weight pressing on him. His mind screamed at him to hold on to his anger, to keep the fire burning, but standing here, face to face with the man he had painted as the villain, that certainty wavered. Clint nodded slowly. "War," he said, his voice carrying a weight only those who had lived through it could understand. "I don't expect you to forgive it. I don't expect you to understand it, not yet. But do you know what war really is?" The teen swallowed hard. His defiance flickered, if only for a moment. The crowd watched, the tension thick enough to choke on. Clint stepped even closer, his presence looming, his voice low but firm, forcing the teen to truly hear him. War isn't about right or wrong, just survival. Men fight battles they didn't start, against enemies they never knew, for causes beyond their control. The teen's hands clenched around the spray can, the faint sound of metal scraping against his fingers betraying his tension. His mask concealed most of his face, but his body told the truth. His stance wavered, shoulders tensing as if caught between fight and flight. The air between them was thick, charged with something unspoken. Round them the crowd watched in silent anticipation, breaths held, eyes locked on the unlikely confrontation. Clint continued, his voice unwavering. "Your father. You think I killed him. Maybe I did. Or maybe someone else did. But I'll tell you this, kid. He wasn't my enemy." The teen scoffed bitterly, but his voice wavered. "You fought against him, against everything he believed in. And now you stand here acting like it was just orders, like it wasn't personal?" His fists clenched, the spray can rattling in his grip. Though masked, his eyes betrayed anger, pain, and doubt. He had come sure of his actions, but now uncertainty crept in, shaking his conviction. "Men in suits start wars. Soldiers just survive them," Clint said, his eyes steely and unrelenting, holding the teen in place. "Your father fought because he was told to, just like I did. War turns men into soldiers and soldiers into enemies." The teen's breath hitched. His eyes darted around the crowd, looking for support, but the anger had dimmed. People were no longer calling for his arrest. They were waiting, listening. Clint sighed. "You deface this memorial thinking it stands for men who killed your father." He gestured toward the statues, still covered in spray-painted slogans. "They weren't politicians, just young men. Like your father, like you. Most never came home." The teen's grip on the can loosened, his fingers trembling slightly. Clint's voice softened, but the strength in it remained. "You see justice and vengeance, but tell me, would your father want this or the truth?" The teen's body tensed as if he were about to lash out, but then his shoulders sagged, just a little. His breathing slowed. For the first time, the anger in his eyes dulled, not gone, but shaken. The teen's body tensed as if he were about to lash out, but then his shoulders sagged just a little. His breathing slowed. For the first time, the anger in his eyes dulled, not gone, but shaken. He glanced down at his hand, fingers stained red with spray paint. The words he had scrawled across the monument glared back at him, not as a righteous act, but as something else, something hollow. His chest tightened. Had he really honored his father, or had he just let his anger speak for him? "My dad." His voice cracked, raw and uncertain. "He never wanted me to hate them. He just wanted me to understand why." Clint gave a slow nod. Then, maybe it's time to start understanding. The teen swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the can as if it held all the weight of his grief. For a moment he stood frozen between defiance and regret. Then his fingers uncurled. The can slipped from his grasp, hitting the pavement with a soft, empty clatter. The crowd, once a storm of voices, now watched in quiet understanding. The weight of years, of sacrifice, of untold stories carved into stone, settled between them all. Clint stepped forward, his voice steady. Respect isn't blind obedience. It's knowing the cost of the past and choosing to honor it the right way. The teen looked up at him, eyes searching, and for the first time he wasn't just seeing a soldier, he was seeing the truth. The silence stretched on. The authorities were still waiting. The crowd was still watching, but Clint had no intention of turning the teen over to the police. Not yet. He pointed to the ground. "Pick up the brush." The teen blinked, confused. "Pick it up," Clint repeated. "You erase their memory. Now you clean it." The teen hesitated, glancing around as if waiting for someone to stop him. No one did. His hands, still trembling, let the spray drop with a dull clatter against the pavement. A long pause stretched between him and the defaced statues. Then, with a slow, reluctant breath, he reached for the brush and cleaning solution that someone from the crowd had placed nearby. Clint didn't move. He didn't force him. He simply watched as the teen knelt down and began to scrub. The paint smeared, then faded. His shoulders tensed with every stroke, the weight of what he'd done sinking in with each pass of the brush. The murmurs of the crowd filled the silence, some approving, others still absorbing what had just unfolded. The authorities stepped back. There would be no arrest today. Only a lesson, a hard, painful lesson, but one that mattered far more than punishment ever could. Clint turned, taking one last look at the statues. Young men, frozen in time, their sacrifice once blurred beneath a layer of defiance, now slowly being restored. Then, without another word, he walked away. At first, there was only silence. Then, a single clap, another, and then more, spreading through the crowd like a slow, rolling wave. It wasn't loud or celebratory, it was something quieter, acknowledgement, understanding. Clint didn't turn back, he just kept walking, the sound fading behind him. The lesson had been given. What the teen did with it now was his own to carry. If this story resonated with you, there's more to discover. Tap the video on your screen to dive into another powerful tale of courage, conviction, and the unexpected moments that change everything. An eye-opening journey awaits. Don't miss it.